We have heard tonight the story of our salvation. There are some big players in this story. There is God. There are the people. And there is the earth and all that is on it. We began with the Genesis story of creation, which in the version we heard talked about creation beginning from a formless void. Another translation that I really like, it comes from wild and waste, comes from a dark deep or darkness over the face of ocean. And from this void, this wild and waste, this darkness over the face of ocean, God ordered things. On the first day, we have light and dark. On the second day, we have sky and waters. On the third day, we have land and seas. On the fourth day, we have flora. On the fifth day, we have sun and moon and stars. And the sixth day, there are fish and birds and earth creatures and humanity, which is given dominion over the rest. And on the seventh day, of course, there was rest. And then we heard the flood, where everything was let out so that everything could abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. And the covenant after the flood was the covenant with the earth. And we didn't hear in the story of Noah that we were to have dominion over the earth. We heard the story of Abraham and Isaac, where there would be no more human sacrifices. We heard about Moses and the Red Sea, the high cost of grumbling to the Egyptians and their horses. But the Israelites needed to take the first step. And then we heard from the prophets. We heard from the prophets a number of themes. We hear about forgiveness for the wicked, that God's ways, God's thoughts are higher than our ways and thoughts. There are things to aspire to. God has prepared the world for all time. Again, more forgiveness for our weakness, challenge to aspire to God's ways. We are given a heart of flesh. Our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and God's response is, I will put my spirit in you. God will renew us with his love. And the question that I have been puzzling this week is, how can we turn from our ways in not caring for this fragile earth, our island home? I have been reading a book called Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. And it starts out by talking about what it calls business as usual, which is a focus on economic growth, on people buying more things and using so much energy. And then they talk about what has started to happen, what they call the great unraveling. where there has been economic decline, there has been resource depletion, forests, depletion of fossil fuels, where there has been climate change, where there has been social division and war. As is usually the case, it is the poor who bear the brunt of changes. A UN report in this century said that it would take $160 billion a year to eliminate extreme poverty and world hunger. Eliminate. The 2010 world military spending was 10 times that, and almost half of that was that of the United States. We are facing mass extinction. The one that I'd read about in this book was something that I never thought about, and that was plankton. Plankton is really, really tiny, and there's lots and lots of it filling the oceans, but it is what feeds whales, it feeds fish, and it creates oxygen. Plankton does all those things. There was a study in 2010 that said that there had been a 40% drop in plankton since 1950. 40%, the thing that is feeding our air and feeding our fish. What the writers do see is what they call the Great Turning. The Great Turning, a transition from a doomed economy of industrial growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the recovery of our world. That involves taking action, engaging in life-sustaining systems and practices, something that in my particular area, looking at farming, I certainly can see in the past, the 20 years I've been here already, wonderful changes toward organic, toward sustainable processes, a greater interest in fair trade that is good not just for the earth, but for the people, and particularly the poor people of the earth, and a focus on what is grown locally, so that the cost of transporting what we eat is eliminated from the equation. And the last part of the Great Turning is a shift in consciousness. So the writers suggest that to get there, we need to have what they call active hope. And so active hope was something that I found really in keeping with the readings for today, because we do see people endlessly in our salvation history not being good, sinning, turning from God, and God remains faithful, and God remains willing to try to help us, to breathe life into us, to give us hearts of flesh, to inspire us to understand wisdom, to understand the ways of God, the mind of God. So active hope has a few kind of steps that they talk about. And the first begins with gratitude. That in order to think about working on this very difficult time that we're in now, we first have to look around in gratitude for what we do have. And I think of that as really coupled with awe. Just looking around in awe at this world that we are blessed to live in. Something in Vermont that I think we can feel very strongly because it's so present to us every day. It's turning to that and away from materialism. Awe is and gratitude are for what you have. Materialism is all about what you don't have, needing to get what you don't have. So you can see how they're really opposite sides of the coin. The second thing that they recommend that you do is honor the pain for the world. It's really kind of the first step in the grief process. And they talk about what blocks us from doing that, because when we're dealing with issues as large as eliminating consumerism, stopping global warming, stopping mass extinctions, these are huge things. So there are a lot of things that block us. Sometimes it's easy to think that this, it's not really real. It's not my job. I don't want to stand out from the crowd. Everyone else isn't complaining about it. This threatens my interests. This threatens my retirement account. This threatens my investments. This is upsetting. I feel paralyzed. Or how can I make a difference? And they suggest that to unblock those things for honoring the pain of the world is to first of all realize that information is not enough. We need to have an awareness that goes deep within us. And I thought a lot when I heard that about something I preached earlier about concerning education of particularly Black kids, inner city kids, where Jonathan Kozol thought, once I let everyone know, it's going to change. And he was really surprised that it didn't. That was not the result of informing people that this bad thing was happening. So we need more than information. We need to have something that touches our hearts. We need to hear the earth crying. They recommend as well using ceremony, what I think of as rite, R-I-T-E, and suggested a beautiful idea of making your own cairn from stones. And when something happens to the earth that you are filled with sorrow about, that you add another stone to a cairn to memorialize it. That we speak about what we're worried about, and that we seek support. Doing that, we then have to start seeing with new eyes. And they consider 4 things around that. One of them is to widen the sense of self. If self is just your body, it's pretty narrow what your self-interests are. But if self includes the community of people around you, the animals around you, the plants around you, your self-interest becomes much broader, much broader. And when I think about that covenant after the flood, the covenant, remember, was with the whole earth, not just people. It was with the whole earth, all living on the earth. So having a broader sense about what is self. And it will then give us connections to each other, connections to animals, which I know many of us in this congregation have very strong connections to our animals, and to the animals we have and to the animals that we have had. They also talk about the need to have compassion and a recognition of how interdependent all creation is. They talk about power and 2 kinds of power: power over and power with. And power itself, the etymology of it, It means to be able. So it really is about the ability to address problems. But that doesn't tend to be the way that we think about power anymore. Power tends to be power that someone has over us. And they actually give a wonderful example of a Danish, I don't know, fairy tale or something about where one king comes and says to the other king, I am so powerful that if I asked one of my subjects to go to the top of my castle and jump off, he would. And the other king said, well, I'm so powerful that if I go to the house of any of the people in my kingdom, they will invite me to dinner and have me sleep there, and I will be safe in their house. Two very different kinds of power. Power that operates from fear and power that operates from love. So they ask us to rethink power and take that power where we are working with others to address problems. They also talk about having a sense of time that's not limited to, this day, this week, this year, that we think back in time to our ancestors, and as important, forward in time to our descendants and the descendants of those we love. And then the last part of this active hope is something that as a deacon, I'm very touched by, and that is going forth. Going forth. And going forth starts with getting an inspiring vision. And they talked about Martin Luther King's dream, a dream that some of which has been realized, not all by a long shot, but some has been realized. Daring to believe things are possible. There was a time when slavery was the norm, when people who had the vision to think that human beings should not be treated this way were in an incredible minority and had obstacles that some thought were unable to be overcome. And yet working and building coalitions and persisting, this was accomplished. It took time, but this was accomplished. The Berlin Wall came down. Certainly in my childhood, I never thought that would happen. And it really was the vision of a leader of the Soviet Union that was instrumental in allowing something so amazing to happen. So it is possible to dare to believe that things are possible that seem impossible. Building support around us. Connections with our current community, with new community, and connections with all life. I think that is so important that we honor this part of our salvation history that we've heard of the importance of all life, of the whole earth, of the water of the earth. Hearing the creation story, hearing the covenant with the whole earth, hearing our calls to think as God thinks, not as we think. We are called to do this. And then to maintain energy and enthusiasm. Redefine what it means to have a good life, to see success in new ways. We have been given a holy place to live, a holy place. And for all our degradation of it, God is willing to forgive us, to renew us, to put God's Spirit in us so that we can cherish and heal it. May we use the hope that our salvation story gives us to do so. Amen.